My parents skipped my grandpa's funeral. Hours later, they were posting vacation photos from a Caribbean beach, living our best life. That's when I got a text from my grandpa's phone. "Sweetheart, come to my house right now." When I got there, my heart dropped. My mother told me flights were too expensive to make it back in time for my grandfather's funeral. She said it over the phone with a sigh, the kind that made it sound like the airline had personally wronged her, like she was the one being inconvenienced by her own father dying. I told her I understood. I did not understand. But saying so out loud felt like starting a fight I didn't have the energy for. Not that week, not with a funeral to plan and a house full of a dead man's belongings to sort through. So I let it go the way I'd let 100 things go over the years, filing it quietly under things my parents do that other parents wouldn't. The funeral home smelled like lilies and old carpet and the particular kind of coffee that only exists in church basements. I'd chosen the flowers myself, white ones, because Grandpa always said anything louder than white looked like it was trying too hard, and Grandpa never once in his life tried too hard to be anything other than exactly what he was. I arrived early to set up the guest book and found myself doing something I probably shouldn't have. I placed 2 folded programs on the 2 empty chairs in the front row, left side, the ones reserved for immediate family. I smoothed the paper flat with my thumb like that small useless gesture could somehow make my parents materialize out of thin air. They didn't, obviously. The chairs stayed empty through the whole service, 2 blank spaces in a room otherwise full of people who had actually shown up, which was, in its own quiet way, the story of my entire childhood condensed into a single visual. The chapel filled slowly, neighbors from 3 streets over. A man I didn't recognize who turned out to be someone whose porch Grandpa had rebuilt after a storm 11 years ago and refused to take a dime for. A neighbor from 2 doors down, already crying before the service even started. My best friend, sitting quietly in the 3rd row because she knew I needed a familiar face nearby even if I wasn't going to look at it. I sat in the front row, alone, flanked by 2 empty chairs, and tried to focus on the pastor's voice instead of the particular hollow feeling of being an orphaned adult, which is a strange kind of grief nobody warns you about. You expect to lose your parents to become an orphan. You don't expect to lose the person who was actually parenting you, and have the people whose job that technically was still be alive, tanned, and somewhere with a beach view. The pastor had never met my grandfather personally, which I'd worried about, but he'd done his homework. He talked about a man who built things that lasted, who showed up early and stayed late, who treated every person he met like they mattered because as far as he was concerned, they did. He said my grandfather was the kind of man who never missed a single important moment in the lives of the people he loved. I almost laughed, which is a strange thing to almost do at a funeral, but it was true in a way that felt like it was aimed directly at the 2 empty chairs beside me. Grandpa never missed anything. Not a softball game, not a school play, not a bad breakup at 2 in the morning when I called crying and he picked up on the first ring even though he'd been asleep. He showed up so consistently that I stopped noticing it as remarkable. The way you stop noticing the sun coming up until you're sitting in a chapel realizing that the sun has, in fact, gone out. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket halfway through the eulogy. I shouldn't have looked. Everybody knows you don't check your phone at a funeral, and I have never in my life been the kind of person who checks her phone during things she's supposed to be present for. But grief does strange things to a person's judgment. It makes every buzz feel like it might be important, like it might be the last piece of something falling into place, and my hand moved into my pocket before my brain had fully signed off on the decision. I tilted the screen just enough to see it without anyone beside me noticing, which was easy because there was no one beside me. 2 empty chairs don't notice anything. It was a notification. My mother had posted something. For one genuinely stupid second, hope flickered through me. The kind of hope you feel even when you know better. And I thought maybe it was a tribute. Maybe a late, clumsy paragraph about her father. Something that would at least suggest she remembered he existed and had feelings about the fact that he no longer did. Then the image finished loading. Blue water. White sand so bright it looked almost fake. My mother reclined in a lounge chair wearing a turquoise cover-up. Oversized sunglasses pushed up into her hair. A drink with a little paper umbrella balanced on the armrest beside her. My father stood behind her, sunburned across his shoulders, one hand resting there like he was posing for a magazine spread about people who had never had a bad day in their lives. The caption sat underneath in her usual looping cursive font, the one she used for everything from birthday wishes to complaints about slow restaurant service. Living our best life. I locked the screen. My thumb was shaking slightly, which I noticed with a strange, detached clarity, the way you notice things about your own body when you're too overwhelmed to fully process the actual emotion underneath them. I slid the phone back into my pocket and returned my attention to the pastor, who was now talking about legacy, about the things a person leaves behind that matter more than money or property. I nodded along like I was listening. I was not entirely listening. I was thinking about how my grandfather had spent his entire life showing up for people who never once had to ask him twice, and how the 2 people who owed him more than anyone were currently applying sunscreen 4,000 miles away. I didn't know yet that the day wasn't finished with me. At the graveside, an hour later, the sky had gone the particular flat gray that seems designed specifically for funerals, like the weather itself had gotten the memo. I stood at the edge of the small crowd while the casket was lowered, and I tried to pray, or at least tried to do the thing that prayer is supposed to feel like, a kind of reaching towards something larger than the moment. But all I could hear, looping quietly under everything else, was 4 words in my mother's looping cursive font: living our best life. The dirt hit the casket in soft rhythmic taps, and I watched it land and thought about all the years my grandfather had spent showing up for people who never once had to ask him twice. I should explain what that actually looked like, because showing up can sound like like a nice phrase without any real weight behind it. And what my grandfather did for me was not a phrase. It was a fact of my life, as reliable and unremarkable as gravity, right up until the day it stopped being unremarkable and started being the entire architecture of who I was. I was 7 the first time my parents left me at his house, not for an afternoon, not for a weekend. They dropped me off with one pink suitcase and a stuffed rabbit missing an eye and told me it would be just for a little while, which is a phrase that means something very different to a 7-year-old than it apparently meant to my mother, because the little while stretched into most of that year, and then large chunks of the years after that, with my parents drifting in and out depending on what phase of their lives they were currently chasing. Grandpa never once complained about it in front of me. I only found out years later from an aunt who'd had a little too much wine at a family gathering that he'd actually offered to take permanent custody more than once, and my parents had refused, not because they wanted to raise me themselves, but because losing custody would have meant losing the child support they were technically still collecting. I didn't know any of that as a kid. As a kid, I just knew that Grandpa carried my suitcase down the hall himself and set a small moon-shaped nightlight on the dresser before my first night there, so I wouldn't wake up scared in an unfamiliar dark. That nightlight was still plugged into the same outlet 28 years later, still glowing faintly in the corner of a room that had technically stopped being mine a decade ago, but never really stopped being mine at all. He was the one who showed up to every softball game with sawdust still clinging to his jeans, sitting on cold metal bleachers cheering louder than any of the actual parents. He was the one who idled outside my high school in his ancient pickup truck the 3 separate times I missed the bus, never once making me feel like an inconvenience, just handing me a peppermint from the glass jar he kept in the cup holder. He was the one who held my daughter on the day she was born, cradling her like she was made of glass and sunlight. He never made speeches about family. He wasn't a speech kind of man. He just stayed, over and over, in every version of my life, in a way that made his absence at the actual funeral honoring him feel almost impossible to process, even though, of course, he wasn't absent. He was the entire reason any of us were there. My parents, meanwhile, existed at the edges of my childhood the way weather exists, unpredictable and mostly beyond my control. My mother would appear for a few months at a time, full of plans and a kind of performative affection that always felt like it was for an audience rather than for me specifically. Then something would shift, a new relationship, a new city, and she'd recede again, sometimes for a phone call every few weeks, sometimes for stretches long enough that I stopped expecting the calls at all. My father was quieter about his absence, which somehow made it worse. He didn't disappear dramatically. He just failed to appear consistently in ways so unremarkable that they barely registered as failures at all. He'd miss my birthday and send a card 2 weeks later with no explanation, like the lateness itself wasn't worth acknowledging. He'd promise to come to a school event and then simply not show, and when I asked him about it later, he'd look genuinely confused, as though I'd invented the promise myself. I stopped being angry about it sometime in my early 20s, not because I forgave it exactly, but because anger takes a certain amount of hope to sustain, and I'd run out of hope that they were capable of being different. Grandpa was the one who actually was different, consistently, for my entire life, and somewhere along the way, I'd stopped comparing them to some ideal version of parents and started comparing them unfavorably to him. About a year before he died, my mother had reappeared again, this time with a new energy I didn't immediately recognize. She started calling him more. She started visiting on weekends, bringing groceries, offering to help him get organized now that he was getting older and his memory had started to slip in small, forgivable ways, the kind of thing that happens to everyone eventually. Forgetting a name here, misplacing a set of keys there. I remember feeling a small, cautious hope when she told me about it. Maybe she was finally stepping up. Maybe watching her father age had triggered something real in her, some overdue sense of responsibility. I offered to help too, of course. I'd been the one managing his doctor's appointments and his medications for the past several years anyway, driving over after work most days to check on him, make sure he'd eaten something more substantial than toast, sit with him through old westerns played too loud because his hearing wasn't what it used to be. But my mother, when I offered to help organize his bills alongside her, gave me a look I still think about sometimes, a small, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Let his real daughter handle it, she'd said. I let that sentence go, the same way I'd let 100 other sentences go over the years, because making a scene felt smaller than the actual issue, and because Grandpa was sitting right there in his recliner, and I didn't want him to feel caught in the middle of something. So I swallowed it the way I'd swallowed so much else, and I told myself it didn't matter, that whatever she was doing, at least someone besides me was paying attention to his finances. I had no idea, standing at that graveside with dirt falling in soft rhythmic taps, just how wrong that assumption had been. People hugged me in the parking lot afterward, the way people do at funerals, quick and slightly awkward, like they're not sure how much pressure a grieving person can withstand. A neighbor pressed a casserole dish into my hands, still warm through the foil, and told me to call if I needed anything, the way everyone says that and almost no one means literally. A man I didn't recognize told me Grandpa had fixed his porch after a bad storm years back and never once let him pay for it, which I already knew, because that was simply who Grandpa was, but I thanked him anyway and let the story land soft, the way it was meant to. I did all the things a steady person is supposed to do. I nodded. I thanked people. I accepted a second casserole from someone whose name I didn't quite catch. Then I got into my car, shut the door, and sat there for a moment with the casserole dish balanced heavy in my lap, finally alone for the first time since the sun had come up that morning. That was when my phone buzzed again. Not a notification this time, a text. And the contact name attached to it made the back of my neck go cold before I'd even subconsciously registered what I was looking at. Grandpa. I stared at it for a full 3 seconds, certain I was misreading it somehow. Certain grief was finally doing the thing everyone warns you it eventually does, playing tricks. His phone had been sitting in a small, clear evidence bag of personal effects at the hospital for 3 days, tucked in with his glasses and his wedding ring, waiting for someone to decide what to do with a dead man's belongings. I knew because I'd been the one standing there when the nurse handed the bag over, the plastic crinkling in a way that seemed too loud for the moment. I opened the message with my thumb hovering above the screen, half expecting it to be some cruel glitch, some automated system finally catching up to a phone plan that hadn't been canceled yet. Sweetheart, come to my house right now. 6 words. In the exact rhythm he always used when he texted me. No punctuation flourishes, no emojis, just plain and direct, the same way he lived his entire life. I sat in that parking lot with a casserole going cold in my lap and read the message 3 more times, like repetition might make it either more or less real, and it did neither. It just sat there on the screen, patient and impossible, exactly the way Grandpa himself had always been. I didn't think. I didn't call anyone to ask if this made sense. I set the casserole on the passenger seat, turned the key, and drove. The route to his house was one I could have driven blind. 22 years of visits had worn the directions into some deep, automatic part of my brain, past the elementary school where he used to wait in his truck, past the hardware store where he bought lumber for every project he ever started, down the long stretch of road that turned to gravel a half-mile before his driveway. I drove it now in my funeral dress, black fabric still smelling faintly of lilies, gravel crunching under my tires the entire way up. His porch light was on. That detail hit me before almost anything else did, before the open front door, before the strange car parked in the drive that wasn't his ancient truck, that warm yellow bulb over the front steps, the one he always left burning whenever he knew I was coming, glowed steady against the flat gray afternoon like someone, somehow, had been expecting me. I sat in my car for a moment just looking at it. Grandpa had left that light on for me 1,000 times over the course of my life, ever since I was 7 years old with a pink suitcase and a one-eyed stuffed rabbit, standing in this exact driveway not knowing what came next. Seeing it lit now, 3 days after I'd watched dirt fall onto his casket, nearly undid something in my chest that I'd been holding together through sheer force of will since the phone had first buzzed in the chapel. Grandpa, I whispered, and the word sounded wrong the moment it left my mouth, too hopeful, too much like a question I already knew the answer to. I got out of the car slowly, still in my funeral shoes, still holding my phone like it might do something unexpected if I set it down. The front door was slightly ajar, which wasn't like him. He'd always been particular about locking up, a habit left over from some story about a break-in on this street decades ago that he told slightly differently every time. Inside, the house smelled the way it always had, dust and lemon cleaner and the peppermint candies he kept in a glass jar by the sink, the same jar he'd been pulling candies from for as long as I'd known him. His boots sat by the back door exactly where he always left them. His flannel jacket hung over the kitchen chair like he'd just stepped out for a moment and would be back any second to finish whatever he'd been doing. For half a second, my mind played a genuinely cruel trick on me, some deep animal part of my brain that hadn't caught up to the funeral yet, and I fully expected to hear him cough from the living room, expected the television to be playing some old western too loud the way it always was. Instead, I found a woman sitting at the kitchen table. She was maybe 60, with kind, tired eyes and gray hair pulled back in a loose bun, wearing the kind of practical cardigan that made me immediately place her as some sort of caregiver before she'd said a single word. Grandpa's old phone sat on the table in front of her, screen still glowing faintly. Beside it sat a small metal lockbox I didn't recognize, the kind you'd buy at a hardware store to keep important documents safe from fire or theft. She stood up too fast when she saw me, the chair scraping loudly against the linoleum. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice shook slightly, like she'd been rehearsing this moment and still wasn't fully prepared for it. I should have used my own phone, but he made me promise. I stood frozen in the doorway of a house that no longer technically had an owner, still wearing the dress I'd buried my grandfather in, staring at a stranger who apparently knew something I didn't. "Promise what?" I finally managed. "That after the funeral I would get you here alone." She glanced toward the door like she wanted to make sure no one else had followed me up the drive. No parents, no other relatives, just you. The air conditioner hummed somewhere down the hallway, an ordinary domestic sound that felt strangely out of place given everything else happening in that kitchen. "He knew I'd come if I saw his name," I said, more to myself than to her. Her eyes softened, and something in her posture relaxed slightly, like she'd been bracing for me to react badly and was relieved I hadn't. "He said you always came," she said quietly. That single sentence nearly took my knees out from under me, standing there in that kitchen that smelled like the entire architecture of my childhood. Past tense, spoken with the kind of certainty that only comes from years of watching someone actually show up, rather than simply promising to. "I'm Denise," she said, extending a hand that I shook without really registering the gesture. "I've been coming by a few times a week for the last several months, helping with meals, medications, general upkeep." I hadn't known her specifically, though I'd known someone was helping him. My mother had mentioned it once, framing it as something she herself had arranged. I was already starting to suspect that detail wasn't accurate. Denise reached beside her chair and lifted the small metal lockbox onto the table, sliding it toward me with both hands. My name was written across the lid in his familiar shaky handwriting, the same handwriting from birthday cards and the notes he used to tuck into my school lunches. "He asked me to give you this. He said you'd know what to do with what was inside." I sat down because standing suddenly felt like more than my legs could manage. "Do you know what's in here?" Denise shook her head. "He never told me the specifics, just that it was important, and it needed to go to you and only you, and that I shouldn't let anyone else know I had it. Not even," she paused, "not even your mother when she asked. She asked you about a lockbox?" Denise nodded, her expression tightening. "About 2 weeks ago. She wanted to know if he'd given me anything to hold on to for him. I told her I didn't know what she meant. I looked down at my name on that lid and felt the last of my resistance finally give way. "Open it," Denise said gently. "I think that's what he'd want." So I did. Inside wasn't what I expected. A slim spiral notebook with a cracked blue cover, a rubber-banded stack of receipts and bills sorted by month, and a manila folder with bank statements clipped inside. I opened the notebook first. The handwriting on the first few pages was strong, square, careful, the same handwriting he used marking measurements on lumber in his shop. Dates in the margins, short observations. Doctor's appointment moved to Thursday. Need to call about the gutters. Then, a few pages in, the handwriting started to change. The lines began to tilt. Letters ran together, and the entries themselves started to change too. She says I spent too much this month. I don't remember spending it. I sat very still, reading that sentence 3 times before it fully landed. My mother's name, written by my grandfather's own hand in a notebook he'd apparently kept hidden well enough that not even his home health aide had known what was inside it. I kept reading. $400 was missing, and there was no receipt. She said it was for my medication copay. I called the pharmacy. My copay is $11. My stomach dropped somewhere below the kitchen floor. She thinks I'm too sick to count. I'm not. I looked up at Denise, who was watching me with an expression that suggested she already suspected, on some level, what I was reading, even without having read it herself. "Did you know she was managing his finances?" I asked, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. I knew she'd taken over his bills a while back. He mentioned it once or twice, not in detail. He wasn't the type to complain about family, even when he probably should have been. Denise's mouth pressed into a thin line. But I noticed things. He stopped buying the coffee he liked, started asking me to check price tags before he'd let me put things in the cart. I set the notebook down and reached for the folder of bank statements instead, my hands not entirely steady. I wasn't an accountant. I was a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing company, which meant I understood numbers well enough to know when they didn't add up, even if I couldn't yet see the full shape of what I was looking at. I saw it almost immediately. Small, regular withdrawals, timed suspiciously close to dates my mother had visited, according to a simple calendar taped inside the folder in Grandpa's own careful hand. 200 here, 300 there. Nothing enormous on any single line, small enough each time to look like ordinary spending by an elderly man managing his own modest life. But they added up. God, did they add up. I didn't have a calculator, and my hands were shaking too much to trust doing the math cleanly on my phone, so I just sat there, staring at page after page of small numbers that told a story my grandfather had apparently spent his last months quietly documenting. He knew, I said quietly, mostly to myself. He couldn't prove it to anyone who'd believe him, so he built the proof himself. Denise reached across the table and rested her hand briefly on my arm. He was scared no one would believe him over her, she said. He told me once, near the end. She's always been better at telling stories than I am at telling the truth. I thought about my mother's beach photo, still sitting in my phone's camera roll, living our best life. I thought about the $2,000 she'd claimed she didn't have, and I looked down at a folder full of evidence suggesting she'd been quietly, methodically pulling money out of her own dying father's accounts for months, in amounts small enough to escape notice. "There's more," Denise said quietly, nodding toward the bottom of the lockbox. I looked down. Beneath the folder sat one more item, a business card, slightly bent, with a name and phone number written on the back in Grandpa's shaky hand. An attorney's name, Elder Law, according to the print on the front. "He wanted you to call her," Denise said. "He said timing mattered. He said if you waited too long, evidence had a way of disappearing." I sat there in my grandfather's kitchen, in my funeral dress, holding proof that my mother had been stealing from a dying man who trusted her, and I understood that the beach photo wasn't even close to the worst thing she'd done that week. It wasn't even close to the worst thing she'd done that year. I didn't call my mother. I called the attorney. Her name was Rachel Bennett, and her voicemail picked up on the fourth ring. I left a message that came out messier than I intended, something about a lockbox and a notebook and numbers that didn't add up, and hung up feeling foolish. She called back within 20 minutes. "I think my mother stole from the man who raised me," I told her, before she'd even finished introducing herself. The sentence sounded absurd out loud, but Rachel didn't laugh, didn't hesitate. She went quiet for a beat, then said, "Don't touch anything else tonight. Don't call her. Don't confront her. Just make copies of everything you have, and from this moment forward, you don't argue with her. You document." I sat at Grandpa's kitchen table long after Denise had gone home, the lockbox open in front of me, and did exactly that. I photographed every page of the notebook, careful to capture the handwriting clearly, the shift from strong and square to shaky, and tilted a visual record of exactly how much strain he'd been under. I photographed the bank statements next, then laid the withdrawal dates alongside the visit calendar taped inside the folder, watching the pattern sharpen the longer I looked. Every unexplained withdrawal lined up within a day or two of one of my mother's visits. By midnight, I had a running total that made my hands go cold every time I looked at it. Not final. Rachel had warned the real figure would take forensic accounting to nail down, but even my rough estimate sat well into 6 figures. Money that should have gone toward Grandpa's medications, his groceries, the repairs he'd stopped being able to afford. Money that had instead vanished into my mother's accounts, month after month, disguised as reimbursements for expenses that never seemed to have receipts. I thought about calling her a dozen times that night, but Rachel's voice kept looping in my head. "You document, you don't argue." So instead, I sat with it. I read Grandpa's notebook entries again, slower, letting myself actually absorb what he'd lived through in his final months. There was one entry, dated about 5 weeks before he died, that I kept returning to. She wants me to sign something today. She won't say what it's for exactly. Says it's just paperwork to make things easier if something happens to me. I told her I wanted my granddaughter to look at it first. She got quiet the way she does when she's angry but doesn't want to show it. I sat with that entry a long time. I didn't remember him ever mentioning any paperwork to me, not once, which meant either he'd forgotten to follow through, understandable given his memory, or my mother had made sure that conversation never happened. Something about that unsigned paperwork sat wrong in a way I couldn't yet articulate, a loose thread I could feel but not quite grab. Rachel called again the next morning, her voice brisk and businesslike in a way that steadied me more than sympathy would have. Here's what happens next, she said. We file for an accounting that forces disclosure of every transaction touching his accounts over the past 2 years, no exceptions. Your mother will have to explain every withdrawal, every transfer, every dollar, under oath if it comes to that. People who've been careful about covering their tracks for months tend to unravel fast once they're forced to explain themselves formally. And if she has an explanation, something that actually makes sense, then it makes sense, and we drop it. And I apologize for putting you through this. Rachel's tone didn't waver. But $400 with no receipt for an $11 copay isn't the kind of thing that has an innocent explanation. Neither is a pattern this consistent, this deliberately sized to avoid triggering fraud alerts. Someone who understood exactly how much attention a large withdrawal draws and made sure never to draw it. I thought about my mother's tight practiced smile. Let his real daughter handle it. I thought about how confidently she'd said it, like she'd already decided, long before that conversation, that this was hers to manage and mine to stay out of. What do I do right now? I asked. Right now you grieve, Rachel said, gentler than before. Let the paperwork move. I'll handle the filing. You don't need to see her, talk to her, or explain yourself to her. Not yet. And maybe not for a while. This is going to take time and it's going to be ugly before it gets resolved. I need you to be ready for that. I looked around Grandpa's kitchen, at his flannel jacket still hanging on the chair, at the peppermint jar still sitting by the sink, at the notebook full of a dying man's careful, frightened observations about the daughter he'd once trusted enough to leave alone with his finances. I'm ready, I said, and for the first time since the beach photo had lit up my phone screen in that chapel, I actually believed it. The accounting request went out 2 days later. Rachel warned me it wouldn't stay quiet for long, and she was right. My mother called me that same evening, her voice pitched somewhere between wounded and furious, a combination I recognized from a lifetime of watching her manage difficult conversations by controlling the emotional temperature of the room. I can't believe you'd do this, she said, skipping any greeting entirely. He's not even in the ground a week and you're already trying to steal from me. I almost laughed at that, the sheer inversion of it, but Rachel's voice was still fresh in my head. You document, you don't argue. So I said only, talk to my attorney, and hung up before she could say anything else, my hand shaking slightly as I set the phone down on the counter. She called 4 more times that night. I let all of them go to voicemail. The messages, when I finally worked up the nerve to listen the next morning, ran the full range of her usual tactics. Hurt, then indignation, then a strange, brittle sweetness that I recognized as the tone she used right before asking for something. By the end of the week, her attorney had responded formally to Rachel's filing. The response, when Rachel forwarded it to me, was almost impressively vague. It described the withdrawals as informal reimbursements for caregiving labor. It suggested that any confusion around the money stemmed from Grandpa's declining memory, rather than any wrongdoing on my mother's part. It used the word misunderstanding 4 separate times in 3 paragraphs, which Rachel pointed out to me as its own kind of tell. People with clean hands don't usually need the word misunderstanding this many times, she said on our call that afternoon. They just show you the receipts. There were no receipts. That much had already become clear. What the formal accounting did produce over the following 2 weeks was a fuller picture than even the notebook alone had given us. Transaction records going back nearly 2 years showed a pattern that started small and escalated steadily. Exactly the kind of slow, deliberate creep that suggested someone testing boundaries and finding over and over that no one was watching closely enough to stop her. Rachel also found something else buried in the account history, a change to the power of attorney documentation filed about 14 months earlier, granting my mother expanded authority over Grandpa's finances. I hadn't known anything about that filing. Neither, as far as we could tell from his notebook, had he fully understood what he'd signed, given how the entries around that period described a visit where my mother had brought paperwork from the bank that he'd signed quickly because she said she was in a hurry and it was just routine. I thought about the entry I kept returning to, the one about the paperwork she'd wanted him to sign 5 weeks before he died. If she'd already gotten expanded authority over a year earlier, what else could she possibly have needed him to sign? I called Denise to ask if she remembered anything more specific about that visit, the one Grandpa had mentioned in his notebook. She didn't remember many details, but she said something that stuck with me. He was strange that whole week, she told me, quieter than usual. He kept the recorder with him even more than normal, if that makes sense, like he was expecting something. The recorder? There was a pause on the line, just long enough that I felt something shift in my chest before she even finished her sentence. You didn't find it in the lockbox? I looked down at the notebook and the folder and the business card, all still spread across my kitchen table where I'd moved them after that first night at his house. No recorder. Nothing that matched that description at all. Find what, exactly? He had a small digital voice recorder, Denise said slowly, like she was working out in real time whether she should even be telling me this. He started carrying it a few months back. I assumed he'd mentioned it to you, or that it would have been with everything else he left you. My mouth had gone dry. What was he recording? I don't know for certain, she said. He never let me me listen to any of it, but I know he used it every time your mother visited near the end. He told me once it was so he wouldn't have to trust his own memory about what got said. I sat there at my kitchen table with a folder full of financial evidence that I'd thought, until that exact moment, represented the whole of what my grandfather had left behind for me. Bank statements, a notebook, a business card for an elder law attorney, but somewhere out there was a recorder full of actual conversations, actual words spoken by my mother in her own voice, and it wasn't in the lockbox, and it wasn't anywhere Denise had seen, and the last time anyone could confirm having seen it was sometime in the final weeks before he died, which meant either it was still somewhere in that house, waiting to be found, or someone else had already found it first. I drove back to the house that same afternoon, still in the same clothes I'd been wearing since morning, unable to wait even a single extra day. I searched everywhere I could think of. The nightstand drawer where he kept his glasses and his pocket knife, the toolbox in the garage, which felt like exactly the kind of place he'd hide something he didn't want found by accident, the false bottom of an old cigar box in his closet that I'd forgotten even existed until my hands found it out of some old muscle memory from childhood, back when I used to help him organize his loose screws and washers into that same box. I found the recorder in the last place I checked, which felt almost cruelly appropriate, tucked inside the pocket of the flannel jacket still hanging over his kitchen chair, the one I'd walked past a dozen times without ever once thinking to check. My hands shook as I turned it on. There were 11 files, each one labeled only with a date. I sat down at the kitchen table and started with the earliest one, my heart hammering hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. The first few recordings were unremarkable, almost disappointing in their ordinariness. My mother's voice chatting about weather and groceries, Grandpa responding in the patient, slightly distant tone he used when he wasn't fully following a conversation. But by the fourth file, the tone shifted. "I need you to sign this today," my mother's voice said, brisk and businesslike, in a register I recognized instantly, the one she used when she wanted something and had already decided the conversation wasn't really a negotiation. "It's just paperwork." "What is it exactly?" Grandpa's voice, papery but clear. "Don't worry about the details, just sign where I marked it. I want to read it first." A pause. Then her voice again, sharper this time, the sweetness gone entirely. "Dad, we don't have time for this. I have somewhere to be." The recording ended there. I sat frozen, staring at the little device in my hand, understanding with sudden, sick clarity that this was the paperwork from his notebook entry, the thing he'd wanted me to see first, the thing he'd apparently managed to avoid signing that particular day. I kept listening. File after file told the same story in slightly different words, my mother's patience visibly fraying across the weeks, Grandpa's confusion and quiet resistance holding steady even as his voice grew weaker. The final file was dated 6 days before he died. He'd been recording her the whole time, I said out loud to the empty kitchen, the realization landing with a strange, hollow finality, even though I already knew it by then, even though I'd been listening to the proof of it for the past hour. In that last recording, my mother's voice was different, colder, done pretending. "You're not going to remember this conversation tomorrow anyway," she said, "so it doesn't matter what you agree to right now." There was a long silence after that, and then Grandpa's voice, quiet but entirely, devastatingly clear. "I remember more than you think I do." The recording ended there. I called Rachel immediately, my voice barely steady enough to explain what I'd found. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished. "That last recording," she finally said, "on its own, changes everything. That's not a misunderstanding about caregiving reimbursements. That's someone on record trying to coerce a cognitively vulnerable man into signing something he didn't understand, while explicitly counting on his memory failing him. What happens now?" "Now," Rachel said, "we find out what she was really trying to get him to sign." It took her attorney 3 more days to produce the document under formal request, stalling as long as legally possible before finally complying. When Rachel forwarded it to me, I understood immediately why my mother had been so desperate to get it signed while there was still time. It was an amendment to Grandpa's trust, one that would have redirected the bulk of his estate, including the house, directly to my mother, cutting out any other beneficiaries entirely. It had never been signed. Grandpa had refused, every single time, right up until the day he died. But he'd done something else instead, something Rachel found buried in the same records, filed quietly through his original attorney about 6 weeks before his death, well before any of this had come to a head. A formal amendment of his own, one that explicitly acknowledged his daughter's attempts to pressure him regarding his finances, and citing that pressure directly, removed her entirely as a beneficiary of anything. He'd fought her off long enough to make sure she got nothing, and he'd left behind a recorder, a notebook, and a lockbox with my name on it, specifically so that when the fighting was finally over, someone would be able to prove exactly why. The recorder changed the shape of everything. Rachel filed it alongside the trust amendment and the notebook, and within a month, the informal reimbursement story had collapsed entirely under its own weight. The estate attorney representing my mother withdrew from the case. Her new one, when she found one willing to take it, spent most of the mediation trying to negotiate a smaller repayment figure, rather than fighting the underlying facts at all, which told me everything I needed to know about how the actual evidence had landed. She never once, through any of it, tried to explain the recording where she told him he wouldn't remember the conversation tomorrow anyway. There wasn't an explanation. Rachel said that particular file alone was likely the reason the case never went further than mediation. Nobody wanted a jury hearing that tape. My father called me once, about 3 weeks into the process, his voice smaller than I remembered it. He said he hadn't known the extent of it. He said he'd assumed the money was for legitimate caregiving expenses. I didn't know whether to believe him, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I didn't especially care either way. Knowing and not stopping it wasn't so different from not knowing at all, not when it came to what it it had cost. The repayment order came through 11 weeks after the funeral. Not the full amount Rachel had hoped for, negotiated settlements rarely are, but enough that the message underneath it felt clear regardless of the final number. My mother had been formally found to have exploited a vulnerable adult for financial gain, and the record of it, recorder and all, would exist permanently now, whether or not she ever fully paid what she owed. She sent one email after it was finalized. 3 sentences, no apology, just a claim that I'd never understand what caregiving actually cost, emotionally or otherwise, and that someday I'd regret how I'd treated my own mother. I didn't respond. There wasn't anything left to document. I go back to the house sometimes, alone, usually in the evening. Denise still checks in with me every few weeks, a habit neither of us has quite let go of. My daughter likes visiting the moon nightlight, still glowing faintly in that same outlet after 28 years, and I've started leaving it plugged in on purpose now instead of by accident. The porch light still comes on automatically every evening, on the same timer Grandpa set years ago, and I've never once thought to change. It used to mean he was waiting for me. Now it just means I'm the one who gets to decide every single time exactly who's allowed to come home.